Hello, everyone. Today I'm going to talk about the Imperial Knights. So, the Imperial Knights were a body in the Empire that consisted of various minor lords and knights who were organized together and were directly subordinate to the Emperor. That is to say, they had that, much like the free cities and the princes, they had a status called imperial immediacy. So, I think to best understand the Imperial Knights, it helps a lot to look at their origins. In the 13th and 14th centuries, the manorial economy starts to undergo some contractions, especially in the 14th century due to the Black Death. And you have these two groups who are under a lot of pressure as a result. These are the ministerials and the Edelfry, the free nobles. The ministerials were technically serfs, but instead of providing menial labor, as most serfs did, they provided administrative and military service to their lords. This was particularly true in the old imperial crown lands in Swabia, the Rhine, and Franconia. And because of this, they were more or less accepted as nobles by other nobles. And then you had the Edelfry, the free nobles, who were just various minor nobles who weren't counts or dukes or anything of the sort, but were relatively free. In the earlier empire, imperial immediacy was not well defined. Counts and various lords and dukes and such were all seen as directly answerable to the emperor, and it wasn't uncommon for the emperor to carve out new jurisdictions out from a duchy or raise a minor county within a duchy to a duchy and so on and so forth. It wasn't like a strict feudal pyramid. But as things became more well defined, a lot of these minor lords had an increasingly ambiguous position. So many of these free nobles and ministerials, who were increasingly indistinguishable from one another, organized together into leagues to defend their interests against the encroachment of the princes, particularly because in the 13th century, due to the interregnum, the emperor was quite weak in much of the 13th century. And they would also protect their economic interests, they would protect each other from feuding, from outsiders, and they would often forswear feuding amongst themselves. Often, if they could not afford to build a castle on their own, they would build a Gan Erbenburg, which means a castle held by a community of joint heirs, and they would elect a castellan to manage their common affairs. They would kick out people who murdered members of the community or who broke the rules, and so on and so forth. Now, in the 14th century, Charles IV, who we discussed in my video about the electors, saw leagues of unrelated knights as conspiratorial. He felt that they were people working to undermine his authority, so he tried to have them banned. However, his son and eventual successor, Sigismund, because he didn't have a good power base within the empire, due to the Hussite rebellions spreading throughout Bohemia and taking away his hereditary lands, which in Bohemia, and so he decided to grant various rights and recognition to the minor nobles and knights of the empire to leverage their desire for autonomy as a way to buttress his own power and exercise his own prerogatives over the empire. At the end of the 15th century, you start to see something called imperial reform, which I should definitely do a video on at some point. Emperor Maximilian von Habsburg in 1495 starts to call together the major lords of the empire and says, look, I'm going to need money in order to fight in Italy and to defend against the Turks and to fight and defend against France. We're going to have to formalize our relationship to defend our common interests and maintain the integrity of the empire. And so one part of this was the establishment of taxes and also the establishment of more frequent Reichstags, that is to say, gatherings of the various princes and nobles. Because the Imperial Knights were not as financially successful as the various princes and counts and the like, and because they claim by ancient right some tax exemption, they refused to pay taxes for the most part. And so they were actually excluded from this representation in the Reichstag, which in return for paying taxes to the emperor, you received representation in the Reichstag. This was problematic for them because they were increasingly squeezed between emperor and the various princes, and they were always trying to maintain autonomy despite being squeezed on both ends, and they weren't really at this point willing to compromise with either in order to maintain that autonomy. Where knights maintained the most autonomy was in places like Franconia, Swabia, and the Rhineland. In these places, princely authority was very fragmented between different princes, and so they could often play the various princes off against one another and maintain autonomy that way. Whereas in places like Bavaria, which were more consolidated and they more or less became subordinated, weren't able to maintain their autonomy in those regions. So around 1521, due to the Reformation and the encroachment of princely and imperial authority, you had a rebellion on part of many of the Imperial Knights who wanted to assert their freedom, and it was very, very, very LARPy. They were led by someone called Ulrich von Hutten, who was a LARPy hermeticist occultist, and a newly minted Lutheran, Franz von Sickingen, and they gathered about 10,000 men, and they tried to take Trier, and basically their goal was to make the empire into an elective monarchy along the lines of Poland, and they were utterly crushed by the princes. The newly minted imperial circles, which were local defense organizations, which were largely dominated by the various principalities, managed to crush them rather handily. And so after this rebellion, the Imperial Knights decided, okay, we're going to maintain our autonomy by becoming very, very loyal servants of the Emperor. And that's what they did. They still refused to pay taxes for the most part of any formal sort, and their initial refusal to do so meant that they were excluded from representation in the Reichstag, but they paid a kind of tax which was framed as a voluntary contribution. And their relationship to the empire and to the emperor was mainly a personal one, and they would maintain their independence and make money largely by serving in the imperial army or serving in the imperial administration, paying their voluntary contributions and so on and so forth. The old Knights Leagues solidified into 3 circles of knights, each of which had a few cantons. You had the Swabian Circle, the Franconian Circle, the Rhenish Circle, and you had a independent Alsatian canton. The Swabian Circle had 5 cantons, the Franconian 6 cantons, and the Rhenish Circle 3 cantons. And these cantons would basically ensure that the knights were protected and that their independence could be maintained. They would also control who could apply for membership and so on. Now, one of the ways, and I've discussed this before, I believe, in which they maintained their autonomy was through a special relationship with the bishoprics. And so, because most of them would never be princes and didn't have representation of the Reichstag, one of the ways in which they did gain representation and more power was a close relationship with the churches. About a third of all early modern bishops were from the families of imperial knights rather than the families of princes or let alone commoners and such. And what they often did is even the Protestant ones would maintain a kind of alliance with a local church wherein they would control the cathedral chapters and elect one of their own who would then become Catholic as needed. And in return, they would help defend the vulnerable bishoprics against any kind of princely encroachment. And so they developed a kind of symbiotic relationship with various churches and abbeys and cathedral chapters and stuff like that, wherein both of their fragile or otherwise fragile autonomies could be defended. With the Peace of Augsburg, a lot of the princes gained the right to choose the religion of their territories. In the case of the Imperial Knights, this was not a complete freedom, and they typically followed the lead of the local prince, although Emperor Ferdinand managed to put in a stipulation that knights who had practiced Lutheranism for a certain time and had already established Lutheranism in their territory could maintain that if their prince remained Catholic, and vice versa. So they didn't entirely have to follow the lead of the local prince. It was really quite complicated, though, because a lot of these knights, although they had fiefs that were directly under the emperor, they also had numerous fiefs that were held in vassalage to various princes, and they would have certain kind of residual obligations to princes, and it could be very, very complicated. But amid 16th century, it was definitively decided that princes could no longer conscript them or their peasants into their own armies or for their own needs, but princes did maintain a lot of residual rights over their territories. For instance, imperial knights had no authority over very, very severe crimes typically, and so their subjects would be tried by princes when they committed a severe crime. Likewise, if their family died out or they committed a severe crime, their territory could be seized by a prince. And princes often, well into the late empire, would try to choke out the knights and annex their territories, although they mostly managed to maintain their autonomy. They couldn't directly invade them because that would violate the imperial peace, but they would do a lot of tricky little things like damming rivers to block the flow of water to their territory or prevent trade from flowing into their territory in an effort to try and get them to submit. This is one of the things that made them very, very loyal to the emperor and to the empire, because as immediate subjects they had direct recourse to the emperor and to imperial institutions when they ran into trouble with the princes. And in fact, during the French Revolutionary Wars, we see that the princes bore a disproportionate amount of the burden of fighting revolutionary France, whereas many of the princes were less enthusiastic. Ultimately, though, as with many of the free cities, when Napoleon invaded, in the chaos of the invasion, many of the princes finally annexed their territories and incorporated these knights into the territorial nobilities, and they lost their immediacy. And then, when the empire dissolved, they remained subject to the newly expanded principalities.